came in about effective altruism. This is from Eric Anderson. He's in the States. He says, how do you live with the pressure of knowing that any time you spend money, you could be refusing to help someone who is suffering? After hearing your arguments, I've had tremendous anxiety and guilt over just living my life. How am I supposed to deal with these feelings?
So I would deal with it by saying, don't think about this on a daily basis. Don't think, oh, I'm buying an ice cream. That could be $5 that could go to some other person. Think about it, say, annually or maybe, quarterly if you like. How are you doing with some giving? Do you still have enough to be comfortable with what you're giving and not feel that this is a terrible burden that you might not be able to stick with? Because I want people who start giving to keep giving. I think you have to just say, okay, maybe I could be doing more, but I know I'm doing something substantial. I'm doing more than I did last year, perhaps. I'm setting a personal best in terms of my giving. So move on in that way rather than agonizing about everything that you're spending.
It's really good advice because since I met you yesterday, I've been stressing out.
Oh, good. You can stop.
I'll do it. But it is, you're a utilitarian philosopher, so you are going to have a very utilitarian approach. So you see things as well as being moral or not, considering the amount of people that your actions will benefit. And you describe yourself also as a consequentialist. What do you mean by that?
So consequentialism is an ethical view that says whether an action is right or wrong depends on its consequences. The right action is the one that has the best consequences of the options open to you.
Well, it leads us to our next question. And it is from the best-selling author and Berggruen Prize judge, Siri Husfeldt, who you can thank now, Peter, if you want, as we're getting a mic to Siri.
So I see this was built up to, but my question is about consequentialism and the problem of time. So let's say a person is weighing a decision, and that decision she thinks hard about and decides to act. And then years pass. I'm talking about a long time. And it turns out that actually that decision has some dire consequences. So the question is, does that time render the original decision unethical?
Okay, so with the benefit of hindsight, we can say that it was the wrong choice. It would have been better if she had done something that did not have those dire consequences. But it doesn't affect what we should think of her as a moral agent. It doesn't mean that we should say that she is an unethical person, because, as you say, she took time to think about the decision, to do what on the basis, I assume, of the evidence she had available and the reasons she thought was likely to produce the best consequences.
Biofuels that were thought to be effective replacements for gasoline, and it turns out, at least according to a number of models, that they're actually worse for the climate. But it's also probably, because this is a collective decision, a failure of the imagination, a failure to play out the consequences. Does that mean that failures of the imagination are in some way unethical?
Well, whether they're unethical depends on our imaginative capacities. And if we make that genuine effort and simply lack the capacity to imagine what was going to happen with this particular change, whether it's a large policy change, in your example, or an individual decision, we can't be expected to do more than use the capacities we have to the best of our ability.
Thank you so much, Siri. And actually, failure of imagination, that comes up in the second part of our conversation when we talk about the life that a disabled person may or may not be able to live. But I'll just park that one for now because I want to move on to the pandemic. It puts so many ethical questions to so many of us on a day-to-day basis. Do you have a moral obligation, do you think, to get the COVID vaccine in a pandemic?
I think that if you're going to mix with other people, you have an obligation to be vaccinated. Because there's two reasons for that. One is, at least initially, before we had Omicron, by being vaccinated, it was clear that you were reducing the risk of infecting others. But there was also another factor which has been very clear. It was written about actually by an American emergency room physician when he described the intensive care unit of his hospital, which was completely full and they were having to turn people away and postpone surgery. The intensive care unit was 98% unvaccinated people with COVID. There was an example of somebody who died because the surgery that he needed had to be postponed because the ICUs were full. You're imposing a burden on other people by not being vaccinated and either minimising your risk of transmission or minimising your risk of needing to be in an ICU.
Because I know we're running through quite a few topics, I do want to get to another one before I let you go and finish your dinner, which is animal rights. You're so well known for animal welfare, particularly from your book Animal Liberation, which you published in 1975, now getting a revision. You say you decided to become vegetarian in the 70s when you were a student at Oxford University in the UK. Did it take long to convince you?
So the first thing that I was convinced of was that factory farming was wrong. You have to think back to 1970. I was 24 years old. I did not know that a lot of the animals that I was eating had never been outdoors, had never been on grass, had never been free to move around. And learning that, convinced me more or less immediately that I shouldn't be eating factory farmed animals.
Do people mind showing who eats meat here? Yeah, probably, I'm going to say 60, maybe 60, 65%. It's interesting. I know there has been change. You would like more. But I had a question from Will Downs, who's in the UK. Professor Singer, would you eat a chicken nugget to save the life of another chicken?
So let me just say that the question is somewhat on a misperception of my views. Because they're not really about saving the lives of chickens or other animals. If animals had really good lives and then were instantly slaughtered, that would deal with 95% of the problem that I see with eating animals today. The real problem is that, and chicken is a perfect example, because 99.8% I think of chickens eaten in the United States are factory farmed. It's one of the worst abuses, I think, that we do to animals. So would I eat a chicken nugget to stop another chicken being conceived and factory farmed? Yes, I would.
I think you've actually answered the question. Yeah. Professor Singer, thank you so much. We're going to be hearing more about animal welfare, the moral considerations of the war in Ukraine, also your stance on disability in the second half of our programme. And we'll be getting a global perspective on your work from philosophers and animal rights activists and our World Service listeners. You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Nuala McGovern. I'm in Los Angeles, talking to the philosopher, Professor Peter Singer, who has been awarded the Berggruen Prize for Philosophy and Culture. You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Nuala McGovern. I'm in Los Angeles, talking to the philosopher, Professor Peter Singer, who has been awarded the Berggruen Prize for Philosophy and Culture. In the first half of the show, we were talking at the gala event in LA in front of an invited audience. And in this half of the show, we'll be hearing from our World Service audience and others around the globe as we tackle life's big questions. How much should we give to charity? Is it unethical to eat animals? And what's the most moral approach to the war in Ukraine? Professor Singer, your ideas are radical, sometimes controversial. And awarding you the $1 million Berggruen Prize, Nicholas Berggruen said that your ideas have provided a robust intellectual framework that has inspired conscientious individual action. We've talked about a number of the issues you've influenced. But what would you say is the thing you are most proud of?
I'm most proud of having helped to trigger the modern animal movement. That's something that I'm really pleased to have done, to have reduced the suffering of such a vast number of animals. And I believe to have improved the lives of people who've changed their diet as a result, because I think it's actually a better, healthier diet and a better diet for the planet.
I have to say, probably no surprise on this topic and many others. When people knew I was speaking to you, there was an awful lot of people from around the world that wanted to speak with you and discuss your ideas. I want to bring in, and this is on animal welfare, I want to bring in Mo Ogunyia, who's a member of the Nigerian vegan community and helps organise the Lagos Veg Fest. It is a vegan festival. So great to have you with us, Mo.
Hi, I'm happy to be here.
Well, you have the ear of Peter Singer. What would you like to ask?
Okay, so my question for the professor is this. What approach would be best to help people understand the moral angle of veganism in this part of the world, here in Nigeria? And the reason is this. Meat is of high cultural significance in this region. Consumption of meat is viewed as a sign of respect and affluence. The more meat one is able to consume suggests how wealthy one is. So my experience has been that veganism from the moral angle has never been taken seriously, except one is able to convince people of its positive impact on health. So how do we make people aware of the moral angle of veganism?
Well, that's a very good question. I do think that we need to try to educate people to see the perspective of animals. I think people everywhere can see that animals are sentient beings, that they can suffer, and there is empathy for animals. I think you find that almost universally, not entirely universally. So perhaps we can get people in any culture to empathize with that, and at a minimum, even if they are not going to become vegan, to avoid buying factory-farmed animal products, because I see that as the greatest source of suffering for non-human animals.
What about that, Mo? I mean, do you see a culture of empathy for animals in Nigeria?
Well, in the long run, I believe that will be a possibility. For now, to be honest, my experience has been that people just laugh and say, these animals are meant to be killed and eaten. And then some people will even bring in the Bible and say, God said this in the Bible, and just twist things around to suit their purposes. Like maybe 5% of people I've met have empathized, but they still go ahead and eat meat because obviously everybody around them consumes animal products.
So let's see how it goes, Mo. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. As I mentioned, there was a lot of response to this particular topic, Professor. We're joined now by Dr. Manuel Valiate, who's the CEO of the animal welfare organisation PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, in Delhi today, in India. Great to have you with us. You have the floor. Professor Singer is here to answer your question.
Hello. It's a pleasure meeting you, Dr. Singer. My question to you is, India is home to the world's largest cattle population and is a top dairy producer and consumer. It is also home to a heavily polluting leather industry. Meanwhile, India is among the worst affected by climate change. What would your advice be to individual Indians on how they can help the planet and themselves?
Thank you very much for the question. Regarding India's very large population of dairy cows, I do think that it's essential that that starts to be reduced. I know India has special respect for cows, but they don't all have good lives. So I really do think that it's essential worldwide, but including India, that there should be fewer cows in general, because cows produce such a lot of methane. And I think this should be a priority for the Indian government and for the Indian public to try to reduce their dairy consumption, to move to plant-based alternatives to dairy products, and of course to plant-based alternatives to leather.
Our World Service audience, they had a lot of thoughts about this. This huge response, as I mentioned, more than 1,000 people were sending in their comments. So let me run through a few of them with you, if that's okay, and let me get your thoughts. Shall we begin in Nepal? Manikumar Gurung, who's in Japa, said, all animals have the ability to suffer in the same way, in the same degree as humans do. They feel pain, pleasure, fear and frustration, loneliness and motherly love. Therefore, animals should be granted the same rights as human beings. Would you agree with Monique? Would you go as far as to say equal rights?
You can't give animals exactly the same rights as human beings. You can't give them the right to vote, for instance.